Well, one step beyond that happens in the 1970s. Private lenders begin to realize they can play the same game. They will make a loan to the Brown family, and they will now package that mortgage together with lots of other mortgages to the Smiths and the Greens and the Blacks and the Whites, and they'll put them together and they'll invent a new kind of stock, a new kind of security. It's called an asset-backed security or a mortgage-backed security. Here's what it is. You buy this thing on the stock market like you buy a share of General Motors or a share of General Electric. But this is a different kind of security. You're not buying a company. You're not investing in somebody who makes anything. When you buy this thing, you're getting a piece of the monthly repayment of all the people in that package, of all the mortgages that have been grouped together. So you buy a piece of paper that entitles you to 1% of this mortgage plus 1% of that mortgage that have been bundled together. That's the word they use. And this was a genius stroke because it meant that American banks, here we go now, could lend to Americans to buy a house. They didn't worry about a collateral because they weren't going to keep that mortgage for more than a day. They bundled it together, made a security, and sold it off to investors around the world. And in a peculiar way, in the United States, and in the sweep of history, try to keep a sense of this because it's going to come back to haunt all of us. All over the world, money that was collected by corporations, wealthy people, even governments sometimes, was funneled to the United States to purchase these mortgage-backed securities. One of the big investors was the People's Republic of China, which meant that a working-class family in Alabama was able to move into a modest little house because communists lent them the money, which it was important never to tell them, because it would have upset them a lot. And it was true for many Americans. The world poured its money in. Why? Because the rate of return here was very high. We charge a lot for those mortgages. And investors around the world said, wait a minute, not only are these mortgages from Americans who are, as we all know, among the richest people in the world, but they're kind of backed by the government, which is right in there making all this happen. So you kind of got the backing of the United States government. Well, now you get a good rate of return in a safe country in the world for capital investments. Who could resist? And what does that mean? It means that all over the world, the discretionary money, and I'm talking about money from Africa and Asia and Latin America, taken by institutions there, wealthy people there, companies there, they invested in those very secure, well-paying assets in the United States. What does that mean? It means that the housing boom in the United States was financed by the savings of the rest of the world. What does that mean? It means that money saved in Togo or Paraguay or Thailand, instead of being used to build up the economy there, was shipped to allow another suburban development here. That's going to be very hard to justify to the next 10 generations of people in the poorer parts of the world. The United States became a vacuum cleaner, siphoning the savings around the world, bringing them here. You know what that is? That's called the reverse of foreign aid. That's what it is. Instead of money moving from the rich to help the poor, we were siphoning the money from all over the world and using it to build houses here. It's very hard. By the way, if ever you wanted a response to somebody who begins to give you a very standard lecture in America about the efficiency of capitalism, and of private financial markets tell them this story. We efficiently gathered the savings of the world for a generation in order to allow Americans to have a single-family home, which is the most inefficient way for human beings to house themselves that the world has ever seen. You know that, right? It's much more expensive to heat an individual house than an apartment or any kind of collective or communal housing system. But it's part of our crisis that this system now involves the entire world. And when the American housing market crashes, it isn't just American housing market that is defunct. It's the entire world credit system because it has been funneling all that money. All over the world, there are individuals, companies, communities, pension funds, you name it, who are in terrible trouble because they invested in the American market of housing securities, and that's not worth much anymore. That's why there was a famous story early in 2008 about a few little communities in northern Norway who had to savagely cut all their school programs and all their health programs because they had been, someone advised them to invest their little community's money, these villages, in these wonderful securities in America that could make you very rich very quickly. And they had done so. And they were now worthless. Another example, and this one you don't know about yet, but you will. So successful was this hustle in housing that we did the same thing in several other markets. You can buy a security, you can do it now, although it's not a good time to do it, but you could do it now, not just in a security that gives you a piece of a mortgage being paid back, but you can do the same thing, you can buy a security that gives you a piece of the monthly payments made by credit card holders on their outstanding debt. There's lots of that around. And you can buy another kind of security that gives you a piece of the repayment of commercial loans by businesses. And here's another one that's going to blow up any week now. Student loans, loans made to students to enable them to go to school. Those have also been packaged. So you can buy a security that gives you a piece of every student who, for the 20 years after they graduate, has to make the payments. You can get a piece of that. There are people, investors all over the world who've done that. The rate of default by American students is now at a historic all-time high. Huge numbers of American students cannot repay the loans they took out to go to school, which means that the people who invested in those securities, counting on the students to repay, are facing a situation where the security is worthless because the people can't repay. That's the same thing that happened when people couldn't pay their mortgages anymore. Remember what you heard about the subprime mortgage? The people who couldn't pay back, so these securities became worthless. That's about to happen. It is so terrifying to the agency in Washington called Sallie Mae, the agency that does this, manages all this, that they have been avoiding to announce to the public what a disaster this is by borrowing money in the private markets, short-term money, to keep making student loans. Why? Because the American university system has become dependent on these loans. What is going to happen to the California State University system? If you go there, you will discover that a huge proportion of their student body relies on these loans. If those loans are not made because the defaults are too high, they won't have the money, they'll drop out of the school, and public higher education in the United States will go the way of many other public services that once were taken for granted, but will now be in very deep doo-doo. These are signs, all of these kinds of crises, all of these, and I can tell you stories all night, of an economic crisis that is just beginning, in a sense, to unfold its many dimensions. We are not at the end or anything like this. Let me turn now to some specific issues to deal with to make sure they're clear in your mind. Over the last 6 or 7 months, there has been much talk in the United States about a recovery. You can see it almost every day in the newspaper somewhere, a recovery. The date of this recovery beginning is March 2009. In other words, that is the time when this recovery, which we're going to talk about for a few minutes, was said to have begun. And it lasted for about a year, roughly March 2009 to roughly April of 2010.